of God in you. Thanks be to God for these indescribable gifts. I'm always interested in how the early churches talked about grace. Grace is one of my favorite subjects, and I find myself these days saying the phrase, by the grace of God, a lot. Because as we, as a congregation, are dreaming about what ministry this next year and 2 years and 5 years and 10 years looks like, there's a lot of creativity and inspiration and motivation. And there's always this little caveat that I find myself tacking on to the end when we're talking about what we're hoping and dreaming of together. I always say, and by the grace of God, we'll pull it off. By the grace of God. It's such an important clause for me because as Methodists, we actually have 4 graces that we talk about. One is grace before you need it. It's called prevenient grace. One is grace that brings you into a new relationship with God. That's saving grace. One is a grace that cleans you up and helps you to live the life that you have been called to and given, and that's a sanctifying grace. And then a grace that strengthens us together in community to walk out this faith for our entire life, and that's called persevering grace, and brings us in down the home stretch. So these 4 graces, prevenient, saving, sanctifying, and persevering, grace just saturates everything we do, the whole way we talk, and how we think about life together in faith. For those of you who don't know, I have a very tight group of friends. I've been friends with them for over 30 years, and for the past 25 years, we, every May, go on a camping trip together. We canoe and break down camp and try and make our way through various bodies of water. We've been in 5 different states, and this past year, we returned to the original trip, the trip that brought us all together. In the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, there is a section that is canoe only. No motorboats allowed, just canoe only. It's just wonderful. And it's the Oswegatchie River is our favorite part of the trip. And the only problem is that while it is secluded and it's wonderful to be out there with just other canoers in this protected region of the Adirondack Park, the bodies of water don't all connect to each other. You have to portage, or for those of you who are fancy, portage, between the bodies of water, which means you're carrying not only your backpack, but your canoe on top of your backpack between these bodies of water. It's exhausting work, and when we sit around the fire at night and trade notes on the different directions that life has taken us, and we all at one point were part of the same church in Saratoga Springs, New York, and well, at least most of us were, and so that flavors a lot of our conversation, talking about what's happened since then and the different directions our lives have gone. And this past May, something really interesting happened, which is one of the guys in the group who has moved from being whatever we were back then. He now is a passionate community organizer, works for the Poor People's Campaign in Albany to advocate for those who don't necessarily have the organization or the resources to advocate for themselves. Just an incredible guy who spends his life in this really specific way of working on behalf of others. And as we're sitting around the fire, he says, I've really changed a lot since then, and don't talk like we used to talk back then, and I don't read the same stuff we used to read, and quite frankly, I'm embarrassed about some of the stuff that I said or did back then. But there's one thing that I always think about, and I still reference to this day. And I thought to myself, hold on a second. You've got my attention. Because if you've left all of that behind and gone in this completely different direction with your life, and there's only one thing in all the stuff we used to say and do that you still hold on to, I am curious as to what is good enough that it has stuck with you for over 20 years. So he had my attention. I said, what would that be? And he said, do you remember when we used to try and get people to be Christians. We used to try and convince people to become a Christian. And they would often say, I don't need that. I'm a good person. Do you remember, he pointed at me, he said, do you remember what you would say? And I shook my head because, I've moved so far from that. By the way, 15 years ago, when I was the first time on staff at a Methodist church, I was told that evangelism is violence, that trying to convert someone to your religion is violence, that you, by proselytizing, are saying that they're not good enough and that the way they believe isn't good enough, they should believe like you. And so, I haven't done a lot in the realm of evangelism in the last 15 years. A little bit, I dabble in it, but not as much as we used to when I was charismatic evangelical. And I said, no, I don't remember what we would say. And you would ask them, you say you're a good person. What scale are you using? What's the bottom of the scale and what's the top of the scale, right? For instance, if the scale is Hitler to Mother Teresa, that's a pretty big scope. And on that scale, and I'm going to ask you this, on that scale, for those of you who are here today, if Hitler is 0 and Mother Teresa is 10, how good of a person are you? I could probably make a case that I'm like a 7 or an 8. I mean, I'm not perfect, right? Total side note, when we used to do evangelism and people would say that I'm a good person, I would ask them what that means. What's it mean to be a good person? And do you know the top 2 responses almost always were, I've never killed anyone. Well, congratulations. And I pay my taxes. Wait, I don't think that's you being anyway. All right. So that was weird. That was always the 2 things. So on a scale of 1 to 10, if Hitler is, let's say, 0 and Mother Teresa is 10, how good of a person are you? And people would, come in usually at the 7 or 8. It always interested me when people came in at a 3 or a 4. I'd be like, I think we need to talk. But maybe they were just being realistic. I don't know. But then I would change the scale. And I'd say, all right, well, let's use a different scale. What if the scale is from Mother Teresa to Jesus? On that scale, how good of a person are you? Right, I would be -4. I'm a -4 good person. I'm in the hole. And as we're sitting around the fire, and as he reminded me of this, I have to tell you, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Because the scale that we use, whatever it is, our internal scale of deciding, like, am I on the right path? Am I doing the right thing? Am I living up to the life that I'm called to? Am I being the best version of myself? Whatever that mental scale is that we have, it's probably a healthy exercise for us to name it, right? Because if you're anything like me, and I hope you're not, but if you're anything like me, you might give yourself the benefit of the doubt and rate yourself on how good you are according to your best day. But other people, they remember when you were a stinker on your worst day. I also know that some of you are very hard on yourselves, and you would give yourself a lower grade and say, well, but I know my internal thoughts, and I would give myself this grade. But if you ask the people around you, they would say, look, you're like one of the best people we know. You hold yourself to a high standard. You serve others. You're generous. You're kind. Now, you're not kind to yourself, but you are kind. So I know that the scales differ, but it would be good for us to name our scale, to actually like maybe diagram it and say, like, here's how I evaluate. Here's why I bring this up on a day we're talking about grace. One of the things I'm very aware of is that we live in a time where the major criticism of organized religion or spirituality is that we have made God just a projected larger image of us. Do you ever notice that God likes all the things you like and hates all the people you don't like? Right? That's the surest sign that you have just projected an image of yourself onto the screen of the heavens and you've got an idol on your hands. It's good for us to acknowledge, and it's one of the reasons we do the call to worship as a call and response, is we're reminding each other, like, I'm actually glad that the God revealed in Christ is nothing like me, very little like me. It makes me happy. It's inconvenient. I actually wish God was a lot more like me, right? But she's not. The God revealed in Christ has different priorities than I do, sees the world very differently than I do, wants me to use my finances differently than I do, would choose different entertainment in the evening than I do, right? And it's good for me to acknowledge that God is not a big version of me, but that I'm being conformed as a smaller into the image of the divine. And there's a humility in that, because if I evaluated myself, and maybe all of you, on whatever scale it is that I've decided is good and bad, whether I give myself the benefit of the doubt and I disqualify a bunch of you, or whether I elevate you and I am very critical of myself, the reality is, for most of us, we don't even measure up to our own expectations, let alone other people's for us. So therefore, I'm very grateful for grace. Because if this were dependent on me and my faithfulness and my piety and my commitment, I'm in trouble. Thank God it's by grace. There's a whole controversy. If you Google it, you will fall down a wormhole. In the Greek that our New Testament is written in, there's a phrase called pistis Christou, the faithfulness of Christ, but sometimes it's translated faith in Christ. And there's actually a big controversy because in passages like Philippians chapter 3, depending on which way you read it, it reads very differently. For instance, if your salvation or your relationship to God or your eternity, or however you want to talk about it, is dependent on you believing in Christ, and also you have to believe the right things about Christ, and you have to believe them deeply, and you have to do something with them. If it's dependent on you, that's one kind of religion. But if the passage is translated that we are saved by the faithfulness of Christ, that's a very different proposition. I'm voting for option B, by the way. Now, I know a Greek scholar, and I've run this past them, and they say the reason it can be translated either way is that it's best translated as both at the same time. That it is faithfulness in Christ's faithfulness. Right? But it gets tricky because if you put the emphasis on you believing, American religion sort of goes one direction. And if you put it on the faithfulness of Christ, some people feel like you've outsourced sort of the commitment and there's not that much of an obligation on you. So to hold these two together is really powerful, that it's faith in the faithfulness of Christ. And I like that. Because the longer I live and the tougher life gets in different seasons, the more I know it has to be by grace. It can't be totally dependent on me. In fact, even if it was dependent on me, I could only believe because faith is a gift that comes by grace. So even the part that does depend on me, also grace. So it is grace before me and grace that covers behind me, a grace that meets me in the moment, and a grace that calls me to be the highest version of myself, the best version of who I am to be. And in all things, it is grace upon grace upon grace. Yeah? It has to be by grace. Because whatever that scale my friend was talking about, whether it's the Hitler to Mother Teresa or the Mother Teresa to Jesus, either way, I don't want to play that game. That feels like a losing game to me. But if it's by grace, and it's not dependent on my goodness or my sincerity or my faithfulness or my personal piety, but that my part that I get to play is that when I receive grace before I even knew I needed it, and I open myself to that grace, and it brings me into a new relationship with God or the divine. And then that grace begins to work in me, and my job is to sort of open up and let it scrub me and clean me and do its work on me. And then after it cleans up the apartment, grace moves in to the apartment and takes up residence. And then by grace, I can serve the world in the way that I'm called to and be the person that I was made to be, and partner with all of you so that our strengths make each other stronger and our weaknesses are covered in grace. And as a community, we are all made better so that we can strengthen each other in hope and then be there for our town in a way that it needs desperately. It's all by grace. I thank God that I got away from that scale thinking and that I converted to being saturated in grace. As summer comes to an end and you begin thinking about your fall, making plans for the new school year, if you're changing jobs, if you're working in your garden and things are coming, the harvest is coming, whatever it is, I just wanted to encourage you. Invite grace every day to meet you wherever you find yourself. If it's a good day, thank God for grace. And if it's a not good day, pray for grace. And if somebody has offended you, maybe give them some grace. And if you've offended somebody, you might have to ask for forgiveness in grace. So that in all things, we would be rich and overflowing in the good things that God has for us.